Outside, the storm continued to howl incessantly. Heavy raindrops pounded against the window pane, blending with the whistling wind that slipped through the small cracks, creating a chilling symphony of the Seattle night. The sky was pitch black, occasionally illuminated by blinding flashes of lightning, like arrows piercing the darkness. In a small two-story house on the outskirts of the city, the flames from the fireplace danced and cast a warm glow against the wooden walls. Nora sat on the living room sofa, wrapped in a gray woolen blanket, her bare feet slightly curled to stay warm. Exhausted after a long day at the hospital, she felt every muscle in her body protest with fatigue. A cup of steaming hot cocoa sat on the table, but Nora didn't drink it. She sat silently, listening to the rain as if it wanted to swallow the world whole. In the flickering firelight, Nora's face was tinged with emptiness. Every time a storm rolled in, this house felt colder, as if to remind her that Jake, the husband she loved, wasn't there. He was away on a work assignment in Houston, thousands of miles away. Nora took a deep breath, trying to dispel the creeping loneliness that spread through the room like the encroaching darkness. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "Just one more night." But the storm within her heart raged fiercer than the one outside. Just then, a soft knock at the door echoed through the room. Gentle, but enough to pull Nora from her thoughts. She opened her eyes, furrowing her brows as she turned toward the living room entrance. "Ethan?" Nora was surprised to see her husband's son standing in the doorway. His black hoodie was speckled with raindrops, and his brown hair was drenched, water dripping onto the wooden floor. The firelight illuminated his sharp features, revealing dark circles under his eyes like someone who hadn't slept for nights. He hesitated before stepping inside, his steps heavy as if dragging the weight of the storm with him. "Mom, Nora, I can't sleep," Ethan said softly, his voice carrying a sadness he couldn't hide. Nora could sense the tension buried in his words. She shifted to the side, motioning for him to sit next to her on the sofa. The faint scent of wild grass from his damp hoodie mixed with the warm, smoky aroma of the fireplace. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Nora asked gently, her eyes kind yet filled with concern. Ethan sat down, his broad shoulders slumping slightly, his hands clenched tightly on his knees, as if struggling to hold something back. In that moment, Nora felt her heart tighten, sensing that something was about to break free. The small room was steeped in silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the relentless rhythm of the rain tapping against the windows, a melancholic refrain that seemed endless. Nora watched Ethan closely, searching for answers in his eyes, but all she saw was instability and exhaustion. The rain outside continued to pour, drumming insistently against the windows, but within the room only the soft, labored breathing of two souls remained. Ethan bowed his head, his fingers intertwining and trembling slightly. He hesitated, as if battling himself. "I've felt lost since my mom passed away." Nora exhaled quietly. She knew he was talking about his biological mother, the woman who had left this world when Ethan was only 15. Nora had always tried to fill that void with care and love, but she understood that some wounds could never truly heal. "You're not alone, Ethan." Nora gently placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, her voice warm like a soothing embrace. Ethan kept his head lowered, but his broad shoulders quivered like a leaf in the wind. "But things aren't how you think. I've tried to ignore this feeling, but I can't." Nora froze slightly. Her gaze deepened with worry, and an unspoken question rose in her mind. "What feeling?" Ethan lifted his head, his eyes burning with a mixture of fear and raw honesty. "The person I can't stop thinking about isn't someone distant. It's you." The weight of his words fell like a blade cutting through the fragile silence. Nora instinctively pulled her hand back as though she'd been shocked. Her heart seemed to stop for a moment. "What did you just say?" Her voice trembled as she struggled to remain calm. Ethan swallowed hard, his gaze filled with pain and shame. I know it's wrong, but I can't control my thoughts. Ever since Dad's been away so often, you've been the only one here for me, and I've started to feel something more than respect. I've tried to suppress it, but it's driving me insane. Nora sat still, her mind spinning. She could hear her heartbeat pounding in her chest like a war drum. Outside, thunder rumbled, echoing the storm raging within her. Ethan lowered his head again, avoiding her eyes. Do you hate me? His voice was small, almost like a desperate plea. Nora clenched her hands tightly in her lap to steady herself. She could see how lost and vulnerable Ethan was in that moment. He didn't need someone to condemn him. He needed someone to anchor him, to guide him back to the right path. After a long pause, Nora took a deep breath. Ethan, she said gently but firmly, you're not a bad person for having confusing emotions. But some feelings aren't meant to be acted on. You're hurting, and that's making everything seem blurry. But I'm here to help you through this, not as someone you're confused about, but as someone who truly cares for you. Ethan's eyes glistened as though he was on the verge of tears, his inner storm slowly subsiding as he absorbed her words. The rain outside continued to pour, but inside the small room, the warmth of understanding began to grow, pushing back the cold emptiness that had filled the space moments before. You don't deserve to be hated, Nora said, her voice gentle but firm. But you have to understand that this feeling is just a confusion caused by loneliness and a lack of connection. I love you like my own son. And that love is not what you're thinking it is. Ethan clenched his fists, then let them fall, as if the weight of his pain had been released, but its remnants still pressed heavily upon him. I'm sorry. Nora looked at him, her eyes filled with deep sorrow. You don't need to apologize for your feelings. But we need to find a way to get through this. A strong gust of wind rattled the window, but the two remained still, as if the storm outside could never be louder than the turmoil inside that small room. Nora sat motionless on the sofa, Ethan's words still echoing in her mind like distant thunder. Her heart pounded erratically, her chest tight with conflicting emotions. The young man standing before her, tall, strong, yet strangely fragile and vulnerable. Ethan looked at her as though he was desperately clinging to something amidst the floodwaters threatening to sweep everything away. You don't understand. Ethan shook his head, his voice hoarse, laced with despair. I've tried to forget, but every time I see you, I feel myself sinking deeper. Nora stared at Ethan, tears threatening to spill, but she swallowed them back. She knew she had to be strong. You don't have to go through this alone, Ethan, she whispered, her hand instinctively brushing his arm in an attempt to soothe him. But that moment felt like a spark in a storm, igniting something fierce. Ethan suddenly grabbed Nora's hand, his eyes filled with emotions he could no longer suppress. Ethan pulled Nora closer, his eyes locking onto hers as if searching for one last glimmer of hope. His warm breath brushed against her skin, hot and trembling. In a fleeting moment of weakness, their lips met. A brief kiss, heavy with unspoken emotions that had been bottled up for too long. Nora felt as though she was being swept up in a whirlwind of emotion. The warmth of Ethan's embrace made her dizzy. She could hear her heartbeat pounding wildly, matching the uneven rhythm of his breath. Ethan's arms wrapped around her tightly, as if he feared that letting go would cause everything to collapse. Nora hesitated for a moment, feeling the strength of his grip, both fragile and desperate for love. In the eye of the emotional storm, a sharp clarity surged through Nora's mind. She opened her eyes wide, realizing they had crossed a dangerous line. No, Nora whispered, as though reminding herself. She gently but firmly placed her hands on Ethan's shoulders and pushed him away, stepping back a few paces. The room fell deathly silent, with only the sound of rain tapping against the window and the ragged breathing of both of them. Ethan bowed his head, his face flushed with shame and regret. He raised a hand as if to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Nora looked at him, her gaze filled with both compassion and heartbreak. The two of them stood there, their hearts still racing, but neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them like a heavy curtain, shrouding everything in a somber stillness. Nora took a few more steps back, feeling as though her feet were sinking into cold, unforgiving ground. Her breath was still unsteady, her heart beating wildly as if to remind her that what had just happened was real. Not a nightmare, but reality. Ethan remained standing there, his broad shoulders slumped as though all his strength had been drained. He looked at Nora, his eyes filled with torment, regret, fear, and a fragile, desperate yearning. "I'm sorry." His voice was hoarse, trembling like a child who had shattered something precious. He lowered his head, his arms hanging limp at his sides. "I don't know what to do anymore." Nora's heart ached as though it was being squeezed. The sight of the tall but broken young man in front of her made her want to comfort him again. But no, she couldn't. She took a deep breath to steady herself, holding back the tears welling in her eyes. "Ethan." Nora softly called his name, her voice gentle but resolute. "This has to stop. Right here. Right now." Ethan lifted his eyes, his gaze wet with unshed tears and filled with defiance. He slowly shook his head. "But you're the only one who's ever been there for me. You're the only person who's made me feel like I'm not abandoned." Those words rang out like a cry in the middle of a storm, striking Nora's heart with full force. "Don't you understand?" Nora took a step forward, her eyes a mix of sternness and compassion. "The love you feel isn't your fault, but it's a misunderstanding. It's a longing for love. But not like this." Ethan stayed silent as each of Nora's words crashed against the walls of his emotions. His lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes closing briefly as though trying to dispel the confused thoughts swirling in his mind. "I don't hate you, Ethan. I care for you like I would for my own son," Nora said, her voice warm but unwavering. Suddenly, Ethan collapsed onto the sofa, burying his face in his hands. His breaths were labored, as if the pressure inside him had erupted into waves of anguish. "You're right," he whispered, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "I've been so stupid." Nora moved closer but kept enough distance so that neither of them would feel tempted to lose themselves again. "No one is stupid for feeling lonely, Ethan, but you have to learn how to overcome it." Ethan raised his head, and his gaze had softened, the chaos in his eyes beginning to subside. He looked at Nora with sincerity. "I'll try." Nora nodded, a single tear trailing down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. "You don't have to do it alone. I'm here, but in the way we both need." The storm outside seemed calm, the sound of the rain gentler now. Yet inside the small room, the weight of what they'd endured lingered like the aftermath of an emotional battle. Neither of them spoke, letting the silence settle around them. Ethan stood, slowly, giving Nora a small nod, as if silently agreeing. Then, he turned and walked away. Nora stood still, watching his figure disappear behind his bedroom door. Her chest tightened, but she knew she had done the right thing, saving Ethan from losing himself and saving herself from being swept away by dangerous emotions. She remained in front of the living room door, listening to his footsteps on the wooden hallway floor as they faded until the soft click of his bedroom door closed behind him. That sound felt like the final punctuation of something profound. She slowly sat down on the sofa, her shoulders trembling slightly. The room was now eerily quiet, broken only by the faint dripping of condensation from the untouched cup of cocoa and the soft patter of rain outside. Nora covered her face with her hands. She could feel the heat of the tears streaming down her cheeks, mixing with a sense of relief and exhaustion. Her heartbeat slowed, but the echoes of the moment still pulsed deeply within her. "I did the right thing," she whispered, as if reassuring herself in the midst of the emptiness. The house seemed to take on a new light as the morning sun peeked through the remnants of last night's storm. Nora poured herself a cup of coffee, listening to the soft dripping of rainwater still trickling from the eaves. As she was about to take breakfast up to Ethan, he appeared at the top of the staircase, looking different. More put together, his hair combed neatly. Though there was still some heaviness in his gaze, the lost look had faded. Ethan hesitated as he stepped into the kitchen and gave her a tentative, lopsided smile. "I'm sorry about last night. Mom, Nora." Nora paused, her eyes softening as she looked at him. She gave a small nod, not in reproach, but in simple acknowledgement. "It's okay. What matters is that you're ready to move forward." Ethan's mindset. He exhaled slowly as if releasing a heavy burden. "I will be. I've thought a lot about what you said." He quietly took the cup of coffee she handed him and added, "I think I need to change." Nora gently took his hand, a silent reassurance that she would always be there for him. "You don't have to do it alone. I'll be here, in the way we both need." That night, Nora decided to call Jake, her husband, still away in Houston. His voice was warm but tinged with concern as he noticed the contemplative tone in hers. Nora didn't go into detail about what had happened, but she made one thing clear. We need to spend more time together. Not just you and me, but with Ethan too. He needs to know that this family is where he belongs. Jake was silent for a moment, then spoke softly. "I understand. I'll rearrange my schedule. Thank you, Nora."
Ethan signed up for extracurricular clubs at his university, seeking healthier connections. He began opening up to his classmates and joined a team project to build an engineering model. Nora would sometimes catch brief moments of melancholy in his eyes, but they were no longer filled with aimless loneliness. Instead, they reflected someone growing and finding purpose after navigating emotional hardship. Ethan slowly realized that loneliness couldn't be filled by dangerous emotions, but by genuine love and meaningful connection. One spring afternoon, the family decided to take a walk along the lakeside north of the city. Nora sat on a bench watching Jake and Ethan fly a kite together. The sight of them laughing and smiling filled her heart with warmth. Jake came over and wrapped his arms around Nora from behind, whispering, "I've missed too many moments. Thank you for holding everything together while I wasn't here." Nora leaned her head against his shoulder, closing her eyes as she soaked in the comfort of his embrace. The breeze from the lake ruffled her hair, but now there was no emptiness or storm in her heart, only calm.